Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome wherever you are. We're really delighted to have you here. I see that we have 53 participants currently. So we'll just give it a minute and then we'll get started properly. We are recording this, so it will be up as a reference. We'll be sharing it with you later as a recording. So while we wait for our colleagues to join us, 58, lovely people coming in. I'll just set us up. This is the webinar for introducing the updated IASC gender policy. We are going to walk you through the policy this afternoon. I'm in the UK, so it's afternoon for me. We're going to walk you through the policy. We're going to talk about the key components of it, and then we have time for Q&A. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you've got a Q&A button. As we go along, if you want to put questions in there, I will keep an eye on this and moderate these at the end so that we will get to your questions. I'm not sure whether you can get into the chat or not, but you can definitely get into the Q&A. We have interpretation with us for our Ukrainian colleagues. So I'm going to ask our panelists to be mindful about how we're talking so that the interpretation can function well. Like I said, this is the webinar on the IASC gender policy, the new gender policy. If you were not expecting to be in this webinar, now is your moment to leave. If you thought you were going to do something about Excel or forensic accounting, this is your moment to gracefully back out and find where you're supposed to be instead. But we are delighted that you're all here. My name is Heather. I am the Senior Technical Advisor for Gender and Emergencies at CARE, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Gender Reference Group. So I will let my fellow panelists introduce themselves, and then we will get started. David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks very much, Heather. My name is David Coffey. I am with UN Women's Humanitarian Team, normally based in New York, but I'm visiting home at the moment. I'm in Dublin, so it's afternoon for me too. And I'm also one of the co-chairs of the IASC Gender Reference Group. Over to you, Barbara.
Thanks so much, Heather and David, and fantastic to be here. My name is Barbara Wachter. I work as a gender specialist in the gender unit at OCHA, so the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in New York, and I am in New York, so it's early morning for me. It's great to see you all and looking forward to the conversation.
Lovely. David is going to kick us off with the slides in just a second. What I also want to do is recognise the work of Brooke, who you can see at the top of your screen, who's done a lot of the admin and who is hosting this meeting and taking care of our slides. And you will have seen emails from her, so a huge thank you to her too. Before we get going, is there anything from the GHAR, the regional GHARs, is there anything that anyone would like to point up at this point? I know this is a bit of an on-the-spot question. If you'd rather say something towards the end, that would be great too. You can put it in the Q&A box and I will bring you in then. So either way, I appreciate that asking you this when we're just getting started may not be the best moment. So let me say that we would love to hear from the GHARs, and yes, put it into the questions and then we can come back to this in our time at the end. So on that, I'm going to hand over to David and he's going to get us started with how we came to this point and what the differences are between the previous policy and the one we're introducing now.
Thanks very much, Heather. Can we jump to the next slide, please, Brooke? Great. So I'm going to start off with just providing a bit of context in terms of the policy and the Interagency Standing Committee and how the policy fits into the work of the IASC and what the IASC, the Interagency Standing Committee, is all about. So the Interagency Standing Committee, it's the highest level of humanitarian coordination forum within the United Nations system. It brings together the executive heads of 19 organizations and NGO consortia, and its function is to formulate policy and set the strategic priorities and mobilize resources in response to humanitarian crises worldwide. The committee is supported by a deputies group, which focuses on the strategic issues of common interest. Also an emergency directors group, which takes action to ensure a collective targeted response to the humanitarian needs on the ground. And the operational policy and advocacy group, which identifies the priorities of the IASC and drives the strategic policies of the IASC. And does that with a number of task forces by their name, tasked with working out the details on those thematic priorities. At the national level, the IASC and all of its policies and decisions are represented by an appointed humanitarian coordinator, who in turn is supported by the humanitarian country team and the cluster sector system, so be it health, WASH, shelter, protection, etc. I'm sure we're all familiar with those. In addition, the IASC has a number of associated entities, and these are subsidiary bodies that develop work on behalf of the IASC with a focus on a specific theme. And this includes the IASC Gender in Humanitarian Action Reference Group, the GRG, the Gender Reference Group, which Heather and I co-chair. And the GRG acts as the global community of practice to promote the integration of gender into the decision-making by the IASC. So the GRG is made up of members which mostly reflect the membership of the IASC itself, and it includes representation from the civil society consortia. And its work includes monitoring the IASC's compliance to its gender commitments through the Gender Accountability Framework reporting mechanism, as well as information sharing and normative development. So the policy in hand, the 2024 IASC Gender Policy. So what is the 2024 IASC Gender Policy? So it's the key guiding document which reflects the IASC's collective commitments and obligations to gender in humanitarian action, or GIA as we call it in short form. The previous version of the policy, which covered 2017 through to 2022, called for a review after 5 years. And in 2023, the GRG, represented by a steering group led by UN Women and comprised of ActionAid, Concern, the Feminist Humanitarian Network, the IASC Secretariat, IOM, OCHA, Oxfam, and UNFPA, undertook this review and looked specifically at the progress on gender integration by the humanitarian system, based on the findings of the IASC's Gender Accountability Framework reports and the IASC's own gender evaluation done in 2022. It also looked at developments in gender and humanitarian action policy and looked at examples of best practice of integration of gender that have been developed in recent years. The review was based on a series of consultations with key stakeholders at the global and national level. So based on the review's findings, an updated IASC gender policy was drafted and presented for review by OPAG and the principals in February of this year. And the 2024 IASC gender policy replaced the 2017 version when it was finally endorsed. And this new policy sets out a framework of agreed collective actions and shared accountability that are complementary to individual member agencies' own gender policies and commitments. And it makes it explicit that gender in humanitarian action is the responsibility of all humanitarian actors and not specific agencies with specific mandates, not just specific agencies with specific mandates. The policy is also applicable to the IASC's own coordination model and the broader humanitarian principles of leaving no one behind through a rights-based approach and the centrality of protection. And it also reflects the latest developments in policy and thinking on gender equality with an emphasis on the advancement of the rights of women and girls who continue to be disproportionately affected and severely disadvantaged in humanitarian crisis settings. Next slide, please, Brooke. Thank you very much. So as mentioned in the 2024 policy, the 24 policy is an update of the previous version, which builds on the findings and recommendations set out in the annual policy reporting of the Gender Accountability Framework, as well as the IASC's own gender evaluation. And as you can see from the graphs there, over the past 5 years, there have been some notable progress across the indicators, such as the inclusion of HNOs and HRPs, which stands at 80, just over 80% at the moment, while others, such as consultations with local women's organisations, still present a significant challenge. Where in the last report, we saw that 31% of crisis contexts did not have consultations with local women's organisations. So that's a bit of background to put the policy into context and how we got to this point of developing the new policy. And I'm going to hand over to Barbara now, and she's going to walk us through the policy statement and the key principles. Thanks, Barbara.
Thanks so much, David, and colleagues. So we will get into the substance of the policy now. So as David mentioned, I will talk you through the policy statement. Then next, we'll talk a little bit about the core principles that the policy is based on. And thirdly, we'll also speak about the core gender priority areas that are really kind of the practical element of this policy, aiming to guide us in making traction on gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in humanitarian action. So you can see the policy statement on the screen. What I wanted to really hone in here is that this policy, the new gender policy, the new IASC gender policy, it promotes a number of things. It promotes collective action and shared accountability for the humanitarian sector in making traction, making progress on the obligation of gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. It really sets out the IASC's commitment in this regard. And we really put an emphasis on making sure this policy is a people-centered, feminist and intersectional document. It sets out a vision that is inclusive and focuses on people affected by crisis. It's also based and rooted in an approach that is gender transformative and inclusive, and sets out to be uncompromising towards achieving the goals of gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in planning, in implementation, in monitoring and evaluation. So really across the entire coordinated humanitarian response. So if we look at the statement in specific, or if we dissect it a little bit, we see that the statement really commits the IASC to maintaining the goal of gender equality and empowerment of women and girls as one of its core priority areas. It also commits to identifying and addressing the specific needs of women, girls, boys, and men, and all of them in their diversity. Right? We know that, of course, there are multiple other factors, also distinguishing their specific needs and vulnerabilities and capacities in crisis. The policy also commits the IASC to promoting and protecting these crisis-affected women, girls, men, and boys' human rights in crisis. It also commits the IASC to redressing persisting and, as we unfortunately see, often deepening gender inequalities and gender discriminations in crisis. And lastly, very crucially, this new policy also puts an emphasis and commits the IASC to promoting the leadership of crisis-affected women and their contribution and crucial role in humanitarian action across the entire spectrum of the humanitarian response. So this policy statement, it's the vision that the IASC sets out in this policy document, but then it also has a number of core principles. Brooke, thanks to the next slide, that the way that we can look at these principles are essentially principles that should guide all the humanitarian stakeholders in achieving these goals set out in the policy statement. And if we just run through them, a lot of them, of course, we are only too aware of. So the policy recognizes, firstly, of course, that women and girls in their diversity are disproportionately impacted by emergencies with existing gender-based discrimination, gender inequality, which of course then lead to women's and girls' unequal access to resources, to capacities, and to being able to exercise their agency in crisis contexts. Secondly, the policy recognizes that disadvantages, risk exposure, and heightened impact of crisis caused by gender inequality can be compounded, and that's the element of intersectionality here, by other factors. So that can be disability, can be age, it can be sexuality, religion, caste, geographical location, etc. Many factors interrelate and interact to create these specific vulnerabilities. Thirdly, the policy recognizes that gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls is critical for effective and life-saving humanitarian action. So it's not only a goal in and of itself, but it is critical for us to deliver effective humanitarian response and relief. And crucially, as I mentioned earlier, the collective responsibility, it's the responsibility of all actors. The policy, one back, sorry, there's two more, Brooke, that we quickly want to look at. So the principles of diversity, power sharing, safety, and inclusion rooted in feminist policies are critical for transformational programming. And here the point is the nexus, so across the humanitarian development and peace spectrum. And lastly, the policy also recognizes that the full, equal, and meaningful participation and leadership of crisis-affected women and girls, and this, of course, includes local women's organizations and local girls' organizations as well, where they exist and are appropriate, is required throughout the entire humanitarian program cycle. And it was especially, and David mentioned earlier, and as we can also talk a little bit about later, this is one key novelty or update in this new version of the policy, that we really included the crucial role of local women-led and girl-led organizations in humanitarian action. Next slide. So now that we have set out the vision of the policy and the core principles that all of our action should be based in and guided by, we want to look at some of the practical priority areas where this traction against our commitment should be achieved. You can see the areas here on the screen, and essentially they're grouped in two different chapters. On the one hand, we have the more programmatic areas, and on the other hand, we have the organizational practices of all the IASC bodies and its members and standing on invitees. So I want to take you through them one by one briefly now. The first analysis, the first priority area you can see is analysis, design, and implementation. And here the core really is that the entire humanitarian response must include gender-targeted and gender-mainstreamed actions that meet the specific needs of all women, girls, men, and boys. And of course, as we all know very well, two core tools how to achieve these are, on the one hand, robust gender analysis and systematic use of sex, age, and disability disaggregated data. But the key point in the policy here as well is that just having robust gender analysis and disaggregated data is not enough. The gender analysis and the disaggregated data also must inform humanitarian action at each stage of the HPC. And maybe just actually a quick reality check, so to speak, here. As David mentioned, we have, of course, the Gender Accountability Framework report that is published each year. And just to note on the gender analysis and disaggregated data front, to note that 20% of crisis contexts still did not demonstrate at least consistent use of gender analysis and disaggregated data in 2022. So there's some progress to be achieved there. The second area you can see is financial resources. This is a crucial area. The second priority area essentially wants a percent or commits the IASC for a percentage or portion of funds from appeals and pooled fund mechanisms to be allocated directly to gender priorities, gender targeted programming, and to maintain support, very crucial, to local women-led and women's rights organizations. The policy also asks that the system makes strides to better track what money is actually going to local women-led organizations working on the front line of humanitarian action. The third area here you can see is learning and monitoring, evaluation and accountability. Here, what the policy sets out is that HCTs, so humanitarian country teams, should have defined priorities and a plan in place on gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. So this can be either a standalone plan, or it can be part of a comprehensive plan on other cross-cutting thematic priorities, thinking of AAP, accountability to affected people, PSEA, disability, or others. And secondly, under this priority area, it's important that HCTs, under the leadership, of course, of the RCHC and supported by the GIHA working group and other gender capacity in place in that crisis setting, should also review their performance against the indicators of the gender policy regularly, and if needed, take corrective action if the performance is not there yet. The fourth priority area you can see is participation and leadership. And as I mentioned earlier, this is really a core part of the policy that was strengthened in this updated version. The core here is that crisis-affected women and girls must be fully, equally, and meaningfully included in humanitarian decision-making processes at all levels. So this is the coordination, the implementation, and the monitoring of the response. And the policy sets out that this should be achieved mainly by facilitating access to quality funding and support for local and national women-led and women's rights organizations. As we know, women's organizations often face barriers to accessing humanitarian funding. So this access should be improved, should be facilitated. And this also includes organizations led by youth, persons with diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, sex characteristics, persons with disability, etc. And here it is really, it's important to note that 79% of crisis contexts, as reported in the Gender Accountability Framework report in 2022, so almost 80% still didn't even consult with local women's organizations in crisis, so an area where urgent traction is needed. And the second element of the participation and leadership priority area is the gender and humanitarian action working groups. And of course, all of you here in this session today, you're working or connected to working in the GIHA working groups. And the policy for the first time really sets out the crucial role that GIHA working groups play in crisis contexts. And it specifically says that that a GIHA working group should be set up in each crisis context. They should comprise representation across the clusters or sectors, and they should include UN entities, INGOs, and local organizations, of course, including local women's organizations. And here noting that the GAF 2022 report found that 82% of IASC crisis contexts had some sort of a GIHA working group in place. So that is, of course, encouraging. And maybe just one element that I wanted to stress here as well is that the GAF report also draws some linkages between contexts that have a GIHA working group and other areas of progress. So, for example, it showed that wherever there was a GIHA working group in place, these contexts were also more likely to consult with local women's organizations. They were more likely to have robust gender analysis in their various humanitarian outputs, such as humanitarian needs assessment, humanitarian response plans, etc. Fifth area here is human resources. Here, the idea is that adequate GIHA or gender and humanitarian action advisory capacity should be deployed to each crisis context. This can be a GenCap advisor or also other existing UN Women, UNICEF, UNFPA, GIHA capacity in that specific country. And that capacity must be in place to advise humanitarian coordinators, to advise the HCT and the intercluster coordination, for them to be able to provide leadership and to effectively implement the commitments set out in the gender policy. Just a side note that in 2022, almost 60% of crisis contexts had an active GenCap deployment that lasted for 6 months or longer. And then last but not least, it's the sixth priority area is institutional strengthening. And this really brings us to the global level, where principals, deputies, emergency directors, and the OPAG, the Operational Policy and Advisory Group of the IASC, along with all associated entities that David, the whole structure that David was talking us through, must ensure, number one, that gender is maintained as a key focus of decision-making on strategic issues and operational needs on the ground through the IASC, and that these IASC leadership bodies must hold themselves accountable to the policy commitments by regularly reflecting and then acting on the findings, notably of the annual IASC Gender Accountability Framework report, to ensure that we monitor the performance and take corrective actions if the performance is not living up to par. So this was a lot of information, the policy statement, the core principles, the priority areas, and lastly, we'll now hear from Heather about some of the specific roles and responsibilities that all the different humanitarian stakeholders have in achieving these priority areas and goals. Over to you, Heather.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Barbara. I can see a couple of questions in the chat and in the Q&A, so do keep them coming because we will have time for that shortly. But before we get to that, my piece of this webinar is to look at the roles and responsibilities and what we do to implement this, how we operationalise it, and who's responsible for the different pieces that we've heard about. So at the global level, we have principals and deputies who will lead and be accountable for the implementation of the policy in all aspects of the IASC's work. So they have the overarching responsibility, everyone is accountable to them, and we also collectively need to hold them to account for making sure that this policy is underpinning all the work that we do. Alongside that, the Emergency Directors Group, their responsibility is to include the provision of gender capacity and necessary resources when they're mobilising agencies and global clusters. So they need to make sure this is in the TORs, they need to make sure that it's part of the SOPs, they need to make sure that the resources are available, that the resources are allocated, and to make sure that that is in fact implemented the way it needs to be. They also are responsible for ensuring that gender equality is included as a learning priority across all support initiatives, including operational peer reviews, EDG missions, peer-to-peer support missions. It needs to be part of that agenda all the way along. Can we have the next slide, please, Brooke? Thank you. So at the national level, then, we have a number of groups, all of whom have different responsibilities in implementing this and into holding people to account for it. So the humanitarian coordinators need to make sure that there is adequate senior gender expertise and that this needs to be written into job descriptions, it needs to be written into recruitment processes, it needs to be part of any deploying team, that gender expertise is fully realised. And so that can come through the GenCap project, it could come through UN Women, it could come through UNICEF or UNFPA, but they do need to be appointed. They need to make sure that there is quality funding to local organisations representing women and girls. As Barbara said, one of the key principles is that this is the responsibility of all actors and not negotiable. And we have seen in here that there is a much stronger commitment to women-led organisations. And so part of this is making sure that the funding is available to those organisations, either through the appeals process or the pooled fund mechanisms or direct sub-granting, and making sure that women in all their diversity are represented. The last part, ensuring that gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls is included in all HCT strategies. And that specifically includes the inclusion and participation in a meaningful way of local women's organisations. So I think one of the things that we see across this new policy is the emphasis on working with women and working with women-led organisations, and really ensuring that they are resourced, that they have a voice, that they have a platform, and that they are shaping how we respond. Humanitarian country teams are responsible for and should be held to account for using detailed gender analysis and also the sex and age disaggregated data, making sure that all of their needs analysis, all of their information gathering is disaggregated in this way, and then using it effectively. They're also responsible for making sure that there is adequate funding and resources to cover gender and protection focused assessments, and that these are specific and concrete to the context, and that they are used effectively in planning action and intervention. Country teams are also responsible for, again, ensuring the meaningful participation and adequate funding of local organisations representing women and girls within the planning process. And again, this comes back to the core principle that Brooke was talking about, which is around the full participation and leadership of crisis-affected women and girls. So that also then comes into liaising with the GHA working group to ensure that the integration of gender is across all the collective coordination efforts. So all of these things, none of them are standalone. They all feed into each other. They all reinforce each other. They should all be working together. If we have meaningful participation and adequate funding for women-led organisations, for example, that will help with the detailed gender analysis. It will also help with the coordination, and it will help the GHAs and their working groups. Cluster coordinators, they need to make sure that gender equality and inclusion is in all the cluster outputs, and they need to contribute to the development of gender analysis and the sex, age and disability disaggregated data. They need to be part of that. Cluster coordinators hold that responsibility, and we are all responsible for holding them to account for that. If it isn't happening, we need to be pointing to the policy and using it as a lever. They are also responsible for ensuring that there is meaningful consultation with crisis-affected women and their organisations, which helps to inform the analysis, it helps to inform the assessments, and it helps to shape the priorities. So all of this is connected again to the humanitarian country teams and the coordinators, and underpinning the work that they're doing. We are also expecting through this policy that cluster coordinators will make sure that there is a sufficiently senior and experienced gender focal point for whichever crisis they are responding to, and that they will ensure and reinforce and support the meaningful participation of women-led organisations. So we're seeing the same kinds of themes reinforcing each other across all levels and across all of the forums and spaces. The cluster coordinators then, did I just talk about the cluster coordinators? I did. I just moved my screen. So the GHA working groups then are involved in providing leadership and coordination and on identifying and addressing the needs of crisis-affected women and girls. These are the groups who are most likely to be connected to local women's groups, who are most likely to be partnering with them, to be working with them more closely. And so it's their responsibility to be hearing them and making space for them to participate and feed in. It's also their responsibility to work with the ICCG, work with the clusters, and work with the humanitarian country teams on gender equality provision. So advocating for resources, ring fencing resources, ensuring the timely distribution of resources, and making sure that identified needs are met and written in. The expectation in this policy too is that the working groups include membership from the UN, from NGOs, from local organisations and from government where that's appropriate. It may not always be, but where it is possible and where it is appropriate. That would be expected. And for there to be monitoring of the compliance of the humanitarian coordination system. So that will speak to the annual gender assessment framework findings and reporting, and it will also speak to working with the country teams and with the humanitarian coordinators. So we can see that these core themes of everybody is responsible. We are focusing on much closer connection and coordination with women-led organisations, much more consistent integration of the detailed gender analysis, much stronger assessments and data to inform action. And that really is what's underpinning this policy. So I'm going to stop there and hand us back to David, who will wrap us up with the slides, and then we will get into discussion. I can see your questions, and so I will.
Great. Sorry, have you finished?
I think I might have muted myself accidentally.
Okay.
But yes, I will quickly have a look at the questions and put them into thematic groups so that we can speak to all of your questions here.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Heather. Yeah, just so one last slide, sorry, to discuss the accountability framework. So with the new policy will come a new updated version of the gender accountability framework. The accountability framework that applied to the old version of the policy was very much based on at HQ level analysis of the output and the documents of the IASC, both at the global level and the national level, so H&Os, HRPs, etc., and with input through surveys from UN Women and from OCHA's gender focal points, and then that information was collated at HQ and a collective report was put together and published based on a review of what happened the year prior. But we want to change that dynamic for the new accountability framework, where there's a lot more ownership at the local level and that review and that analysis done, and we would very much like that to be part of the output of the GHAR working group. So based on a set of indicators that correspond to the priorities and the roles and responsibilities set out in the policy, having an annual review at that local level to see the extent to which the local context is keeping up, looking at the successes as well as looking at the gaps and challenges. And then through that process, we hope that we can create an automated dashboard or a scorecard at the local level, which can give a quick snapshot of how things are going, and then those scorecards feeding up at the global level to a dashboard and to a global report. So we very much, as the accountability framework stands, we certainly don't want to see this as a policing exercise. We want this to be, as said, owned at the local level, throughout all levels, from the GHAR working group up to the HC, the HCT, the clusters, etc., and utilizing this, not for a scolding exercise, but more for guidance and seeing where things are going well and seeing where things need to be adjusted to keep it on track. So at the moment, the GRG, we're going through a consultative process and a review of the new policy, and we're trying to design this accountability framework. We have Emily on board, who is leading that work for us, and she has been reaching out to the regional GHAs and to some of the national GHAs to get that input. So watch this space. The new accountability framework, we hope, will be completed or developed sometime in the coming months. And before the year is out, we will do another series of webinars where we'll introduce the new accountability framework and how it will work, and we'll take it from there. Okay, I'll leave it there, Heather. I think that wraps up the presentation. So over to you for the Q&A.
Lovely, thank you. There was a question about scorecards, actually, and in-country reviews against the requirements, and I think you've just answered that with that last slide and the intention in there. We also had a question about the gender assessment framework, that the 2022 one is the most recent one, and there is a new one in development now.
Yeah, exactly.
So
because we always look at the year prior, so it's now 2024. We're now looking at 2023. You know, what happened in 2023 in terms of the current IASC gender policy, which still applied then.
Yeah, and we are also, the gender reference group, starting work on a gender assessment framework against this new policy too. So that's part of the work plan for this year. So I hope that answers those questions. We have a lot of questions about funding and resourcing. Question on the GF is answered. Thank you very much. Lovely. So there's a lot of questions here about resourcing. There is a question about issues with when there isn't senior gender expertise. It ends up relying on individual agencies, and that sometimes brings a tension between individual agency ambition and capacity, actually. There's also a connected question here about turnover, and in some contexts, the high turnover of gender experts because the contexts are so challenging. There's a question about, there are two questions actually, about funding limitations and resourcing. How do we make it everyone's responsibility when gender is one of the first things to be cut? And how do we advocate for funding in contexts like Afghanistan, for example, where the space for women's organisations is rapidly shrinking and where resourcing their participation is increasing significantly because of the demands that are made on them in terms of being accompanied, in terms of how they are able to get involved. So there's quite a lot of different pieces in that, but it is all around resourcing and all around making sure that those things happen. And how do we make sure that the resources are available for the senior gender expertise? And how do we mitigate against high turnover? So David and Barbara, if you have any thoughts about that, we would really like.
Sure, I can go first on that one. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we recognise that scenario, unfortunately, very clearly. Across the board, humanitarian funding is shrinking whilst the numbers of people in need is going up. We hope that this policy sets in place a focus on the clear need to have that dedicated gender and humanitarian space, and we hope that we can utilize it to leverage support from donors, to help out UN Women. We're very much committed to raising the funds to have our gender advisory capacity in place in as many crisis contexts as we can. But ourselves, like everybody else, we're at the mercy of current conditions. But we certainly advocate and we will be utilizing this new policy to advocate for that support. And we very much put the argument that in these straitened times of support, in terms of funding levels, and finding the ways and means of streamlining humanitarian boundary setting, etc. Now is not the time to be seeing the integration of gender into humanitarian action as something to cut in terms of saving money. Evidence shows that gender targeted programming and gender integrated programming is more effective and more cost efficient. And in times where there's less money, if you can find any strategies that can help stretch those dollars you know, you should be jumping on it, and adequately integrated gender would be, you know, a key solution, one of the key solutions to addressing this difficult situation. Barbara, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
I think you set that out very well. I think I would, you know, agree with you that yes, at the end of the day, it is a policy, but we wanted to make sure that the language of this policy is so ambitious, including on, you know, as we mentioned earlier, a certain percentage of funding having to go to gender equality, having to go to gender priorities, the GIHA working groups having to be set up in each country context. So all of this language that is ambitious, as David said, is supposed to be a tool that we can use to hold the different parts of the system accountable. So rather than this policy, you know, there to solve all of our issues, it is really a tool that we should all be using to shout as loudly as we can about the incredibly dire situation we are facing, and that, as David said, really now is not the time to you know, cut back and to compromise on gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. So again, it is a policy, but it is an ambitious one that can be utilized by all of us to make that argument, to continue pushing for that change to happen in all of the different organizations and spaces that we operate in.
Thank you both. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think as a policy, it's a tool and an instrument for advocacy, actually. And part of the value of that for me is that it becomes less about, as gender experts, being the individual saying, I think we need to do X, Y, and Z, and being able to say, actually, the policy is this, and we need to be aligned with the policy. So it's about backup for the arguments that we're making, and it's an instrument and a tool that we can use as a reference point. And I think partly for advocacy purposes and also partly for reinforcement. There is a question that I think is really connected to that actually here about, in the light of current backlash against gender equality, does this policy or the gender reference group more broadly include considerations for responding to that, building support, risk sharing, building solidarity, etc.? I think that that's a really important question. Personally, I tend not to think about it as backlash. I think it's power doing what power does, and it's resistance to gender equality, because inequality benefits some people, and so they have a lot invested in sustaining it. And every time we're trying to change that, there will be resistance to it, and that's what we see, that kind of resistance. I think, again, what this comes back to for me is that this is a lever for us, and it's a lever that we can pull on. It's an instrument we can use. And I think, yes, there is a huge role for the GIHA working groups responding to this sort of resistance and strategizing around it, because we know that in many countries currently, the resistance to any sort of movement on this is enormous, and it is violent. And so we really do need to think about, in our context, we need to think about the how really carefully. And for me, that comes into the piece about working with women-led organisations and really understanding the risks that they face, the risks that they're prepared to take, because actually there's a risk in doing nothing as well as a risk in acting, and working with them to build that support and be really mindful of who's going to carry those risks, because generally it's not us. Generally it is women-led organisations who are being extremely brave. So I would say that for me, the inclusion in this and the emphasis in this on working with women-led organisations is really important in working around this resistance and this pushback as well. And I appreciate that that doesn't fully answer the question, but it is a really, really important piece of it. There is a quick question here about, is there a mechanism for connecting between national level GIHAs and working groups and the gender reference group? And the really, really fast answer to that is me. You are very welcome to get in touch with me anytime you like directly, and I will be later this year setting up some meetings for the GL working groups and the GIG. So I will try to do that regionally, actually, so that the timing and the language pieces are the most effective, and that actually will become the platform for dialogue. So I hope that that helps me. I am your platform. And then we have a question. I'm mindful about time. We have a question about how do we mainstream this policy across multiple actors when we have, in a country context, a number of clusters and OCHA and various other coordination groups. How do we mainstream it across all of this? And attached to that, there is a question around how is this going to be disseminated and socialised more fully at national levels? So, David and Barbara, over to you.
Sure. Yes, thanks, Heather. Yeah, excellent questions. So this series of webinars is the initial gambit, as it were, of the dissemination process. The policy and the slides that you saw, what myself, Barbara, and Heather have been saying. The transcript of that is all of these things are being translated from English to Arabic, French, and Spanish. These materials will be shared widely, and we'll be doing these webinars in those different languages across the different regions at sympathetic time zones globally. And we very much encourage the GHAO working groups, the 80% of crisis contexts and rising, we hope, of GHAO with GHAO working groups to utilize these materials and do yet more of their own local webinars or local presentations. And of course, all of these materials can be contextualized to your specific location, as long as they remain faithful to the contents of the policy. So we're very much looking to, as I said about the accountability framework, having that localized ownership. We also want to see that localized ownership with the policy in and of itself. And that dissemination. So as said, these materials will be freely available. The translations are close to completion, and if anyone wants to take the initiative to translate into further languages, Ukrainian as a case in point, we would very much welcome that as well. Barbara, I don't know if you've anything to add to that, or Heather.
All good from my side.
Okay, I have another couple of questions that are quite connected to each other. The first one is around the ERC flagship is emerging as a model for reforming humanitarian response. Is there any forward-looking policy adjustments for a change in approach around humanitarian response? And alongside that, what's the accountability to this policy of actors such as UNHCR when they're coordinating refugee responses? I think those two are in the same general postcode. So David and Barbara, what are your thoughts?
From the UNHCR perspective, from that side of things, so this policy speaks directly to crisis contexts that come under the IASC stewardship. So that those are non-refugee settings. So that it wouldn't necessarily apply to refugee settings, which would come under refugees or UNHCR's management. But the same principles apply. Perhaps we could open up conversations with the UNHCR and see how we could help them utilize in terms of an accountability framework mechanism at the refugee level, which I'm pretty sure as of yet doesn't exist. I know Moldova did their own accountability report, which was great to see, but that was on an individual basis. So that would be a separate piece of work to this. This is specifically relates to the IASC gender policy and IASC crisis contexts, which are non-refugee contexts. Barbara, I don't know if you've anything to say on the ERC.
Yeah, sure. If I understand the question correctly, I mean that as David mentioned, so the IASC policy, of course, this is now updated for the following 4 years. For those who don't know, the IASC initiative or the flagship initiative, it is going to be a period of 3 years where this is going to be piloted in 4 country contexts. And I think at this stage, of course, they're sort of two separate things. However, and of course, the core areas that the flagship initiative is looking at, they're also core areas in the gender policies. There's a lot of alignment. I mean, the flagship initiative, it aims to put people affected by crises and their priorities, needs and capacities at the center of everything we do in the humanitarian response. There's also, a big focus on gender risks and vulnerabilities in crisis, with special concern for intersectionalities and etc. in communities at risk. So there's a lot of similarities in the 2 processes, and I am sure that after the initial 3 years, there will be regular evaluation, learning, and so on, and then adjustment as well. I think, of course, there will be a conversation further down the line how that might then also impact a potential update of the IASC gender policy. But at the moment, this is the update that we are looking at for the following 4 years. And in that sense, it is separate from the flagship initiative. I hope that more or less answers.
Thank you both. I have the last questions that we have here are around monitoring and measuring. And there are a number of these. The first one is there a new gender marker tool coming alongside this policy? How do we measure the effectiveness of women-led organisations? How do we measure intersectionality and the inclusion of proper intersectional working? And then lastly, which I think speaks to a very familiar dynamic for a lot of people, how do we make sure that cluster coordinators take accountability and don't outsource it to, or delegate the responsibility to gender focal points? So we've got 4 pieces to the measuring and monitoring question. One about the gender marker, one about how we monitor the effectiveness of women-led organisations and their roles. How do we monitor and measure around intersectionality? And how do we make sure cluster coordinators do take accountability and don't delegate this or outsource it? So any thoughts about that would be really welcome.
Sure. I don't have the answer to all of these questions. Certainly the question of impact and the effectiveness of the implementation of the policy, and that includes including local women's organization. That is certainly something that we hope to address in the updated accountability framework, though that comes with the caveats. We have to manage expectations of what it is we potentially can monitor on a relatively straightforward basis, and similarly with issues of intersectionality. That will be something that we will be looking at through the new accountability framework. I'm not aware of a new gender marker. I know that the already existing gender and age marker is alive and well, and I know the extent to which it's used differs from one context to the next. It's not specifically cited in the IASC gender policy. But definitely recognise its value as a tool in the project design process and the integration and making sure gender is adequately integrated, be it targeted or mainstream there. Barbara, you were speaking earlier, was it today, about the GRG meeting about the gender and age marker?
Yeah, so the IASC gender with age marker is still, as David says, alive and well. Obviously, it's not directly a tool of the policy, but it is an IASC system-wide tool that is in existence. So just for anyone, there have been a couple of updates. So some of you might know that in 2021, the IASC GAM underwent quite a large update to include notably disability in the tracking as well, and some other areas. And there is currently also a lot going on in terms of data updates and data migration and so on. So in case anyone on this call faces or has faced issues, if that's part of this question anyway, issues with accessing some of the GAM data, you can reach out to me or to OCHA generally, as we are currently at least managing the GAM. And then just for everybody's awareness, there's also the UNCT Gender Equality Marker, or UNCG GEM, which is tracking monies or UNCT monies that are allocated towards gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. This is a system-wide tool specifically for UN country teams. So these are the kind of the trackers that we have, but there's no plan for any updated or new tracker at the moment.
Thank you both. And speaking for myself, what I would really like to see in the accountability framework would also be something around the meaningful participation of women-led organisations. I think the effectiveness and generating data and some evidence around the effectiveness is really, really important. I also think it would behove us really to look at what level of participation they have and how meaningful they feel it is, and whether they are getting what they need from it and are able to express what they need and be responded to. So I would like to see that in there too, as well as thinking about intersectionality and what kind of intersectionality we're thinking about. We have one last question. I'm aware that we are just over time and I don't want to steal any more from you, but there is one last question about, does the new policy indicate if the GIHA co-chairs have a seat in the ISWGs or the HCTs? David, have you?
Sure. It doesn't specifically call for the co-chairs of the GIHA working groups to be members of the HCT, but it does specifically call on the HCTs to engage directly with the GIHA working groups, and utilize them as a key tool. Just speaking on behalf of UN Women, the last mapping exercise that we did on the GIHA working groups, UN Women was co-chairing quite a few of those, and we are members of the HCTs. So a lot of overlap there, but yeah, I mean, that, I won't say it's coincidence, but it's that connection is there. But no, it is not specifically cited in the policy that the chairs of the GIHA working groups have to sit on the HCT.
Thank you very much. I think this for me goes back to the policy being a lever for advocacy as much as something that needs to be implemented and an instrument for pushing for change. And if in a particular context it would be appropriate and useful for the GIHAs to be represented in the clusters, then I think I would really encourage you to use this policy as a lever towards that participation, because it's really clear that the connections are very strong and there are overlapping responsibilities. Hadia Nusrat, there is a GenCap who is a GenCap in the Philippines, has a question specifically for Barbara. I would suggest that you get in touch with Barbara directly, because it looks like a question for her specifically. And I think we have answered all of our questions, and we are 4 minutes past the hour, which is slightly over, but not bad. Not quite my personal best for on-time finishing, but almost. Thank you all so much for your participation and for some really, really excellent questions. These have been really important, I think, for everybody. And I really appreciate how many of you are participating as well. We have 97 participants, which has been really more than we anticipated, which is
Well,
great.
we peaked out at 129. I was keeping an eye on the
Did we?
yes, so excellent. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for participating. We will be sharing the presentation on the gender policy. We will be sharing this recording and we will be sharing the slide decks as well. So you will have access to all of these as resources. Thank you so much for your presence and your participation. It's been really a pleasure talking to you this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you so much.